Look at the small container of salt sitting somewhere in your kitchen right now. It costs next to nothing. You could leave it open, spill half of it, and never think about the loss again. For most of human history, that was almost unimaginable. Salt wasn't a seasoning people took for granted. It was one of the only things standing between a family and a winter with no food at all, and entire empires built roads, taxed peasants into rebellion, and marched armies to control it. Somewhere between then and now, the most fought-over substance in human history quietly became something you buy in bulk for less than a coffee. Understanding how that happened will change the way you look at the shaker on your table. Start with the problem salt actually solved, because it wasn't flavor, not originally. Before refrigeration existed in any form, the single biggest threat to a community wasn't finding food, it was keeping food edible after you'd found it. Meat spoils within days. Fish spoils faster. A good hunt or a good catch that couldn't be preserved was calories that would rot before winter arrived. Salt solved this almost by accident of chemistry. Packed heavily into meat or fish, salt draws water out of the tissue through osmosis, and that same process pulls water out of the bacteria and microorganisms that cause decay, leaving them unable to survive. Evidence of salt, used specifically to preserve fish and meat, stretches back thousands of years, showing up in early Chinese and Mesopotamian food processing sites. And the practice only spread further as farming societies grew large enough that keeping a food surplus alive through winter became a matter of survival for the whole group. Salted, dried meat and fish could last for months. That single property turned salt from a nice-to-have into genuine insurance against starvation, which meant that whoever controlled salt controlled something closer to a life support system than a spice rack. And the Roman Empire understood that leverage better than almost anyone. Here's where the most famous salt story of all shows up, and it's worth being honest about how shaky parts of it actually are. The English word salary comes from the Latin salarium, and salarium is clearly connected to sal, the Latin word for salt. For generations, popular history has repeated a tidy version of that connection, that Roman soldiers were literally paid in salt. The real picture, according to historians who have actually chased the sources, is messier and more interesting. No surviving ancient text explains exactly what a salarium originally covered, and a widely repeated quotation, often attributed to Pliny the Elder, claiming soldiers were paid in salt, doesn't actually appear anywhere in Pliny's surviving writing at all. The most careful modern reading is that salarium likely began as some kind of salt allowance, or money earmarked for buying salt, which gradually blurred into salary in the more general sense we use today. Whether Roman legionaries were ever handed literal crystals of salt as wages remains genuinely disputed. What isn't disputed is that Rome cared enough about salt to build infrastructure around it. That infrastructure still has a name on modern maps: the Via Salaria, literally the Salt Road, a route built to move salt from coastal salt pans on the Adriatic inland toward Rome, one of the earliest major roads the growing republic ever constructed. Salt wasn't a side detail of Roman logistics. It got its own highway, centuries before Rome built roads for almost anything else. Rome wasn't unique in organizing its economy around salt, either. Thousands of kilometers south, across the Sahara Desert, an entirely separate salt economy had been running for centuries, on a scale that's almost hard to picture today. Camel caravans crossed the desert from salt mines like Taghaza and Taoudeni, hauling thick slabs of rock salt cut straight from ancient dried seabeds southward into West Africa. There, salt met gold, quite literally. Historical accounts describe salt being traded for gold at rates that, in some regions and periods, ran close to equal weight, salt for gold, pound for pound. By the 10th century, that trade had helped build the wealth of West African empires like Ghana and later Mali, kingdoms whose gold reserves became legendary partly because of what they were able to trade for it. A substance you can scrape off a lakebed was, for a stretch of history, worth roughly the same as the most desired metal on the planet. Which raises the obvious question. If a government controls something everybody physically needs to survive, what do governments generally do with that kind of leverage? They tax it, aggressively, and salt taxes turn out to be one of the most reliably explosive forms of taxation in recorded history. In France, a tax on salt called the Gabelle was formalized in the 1300, and with revisions and brief suspensions, lasted for roughly 600 years. It was deeply unpopular by design. Different regions were forced to pay wildly different rates, smuggling salt became a serious crime, and ordinary households were often required to buy a fixed minimum amount of taxed salt whether they needed it or not. Historians consistently list the Gabelle among the grievances that helped push France toward revolution in 1789. A tax on a mineral everyone needed, resented by nearly everyone forced to pay it. France wasn't the only empire that discovered how dangerous a salt tax could be. In British-ruled India, the colonial government held a strict monopoly on salt production and imposed a tax on it, banning Indians from freely making or collecting their own salt from the coastline, even though salt occurs naturally along huge stretches of that coast. In March 1930, Mahatma Gandhi turned that specific law into a stage for the entire independence movement. He walked, at the head of a growing crowd, from Sabarmati Ashram toward the coastal village of Dandi, a journey of roughly 240 miles over 24 days. At the shore, he broke the law in the simplest way imaginable. He picked up a lump of natural salt from the sand. It wasn't sabotage. It wasn't violence. It was a deliberate, symbolic, illegal act of making salt, and it worked precisely because everybody understood exactly what was at stake and why. Tens of thousands of people were eventually arrested across India in the protests that followed, and the Salt March became one of the defining images of the campaign that would end British rule less than 2 decades later. A tax on a household seasoning helped end an empire. Here's the part that rarely makes it into the story, though. Salt's importance wasn't only about flavor or survival calories. It was also chemically foundational to entire categories of goods that had nothing to do with food. Salt was essential to tanning leather, to dyeing cloth, to early glass-making and soap-making, and to preserving specimens and materials for trade and transport over long distances. A society without reliable salt access wasn't just eating blander food, it was economically constrained in ways that touched nearly every craft that depended on chemistry to function. Controlling salt meant controlling far more of the economy than the price of one seasoning would suggest. So for thousands of years, that was the deal. Salt was scarce enough and essential enough to be worth roads, taxes, monopolies, and eventually revolutions. Then, over the course of roughly a century, nearly all of that leverage evaporated, and it happened for 2 separate reasons arriving at almost the same time. The first reason was industrial-scale mining. Through the 1800s, improved drilling and mining techniques let companies reach enormous underground salt deposits, ancient seabeds compressed for millions of years, far larger and far cheaper to exploit than traditional salt pans or coastal evaporation ponds had ever been. Salt that had once required careful evaporation, taxation-friendly scarcity, and centuries-old trade routes to move could now be pulled out of the ground by the ton and shipped cheaply almost anywhere. Supply, essentially overnight on a historical timescale, stopped being the limiting factor it had been for the entirety of prior human history. The second reason finished the job: mechanical refrigeration. As reliable refrigeration spread through the late 1800s and into the 20th century, salting stopped being the only realistic way to keep meat and fish edible for months at a time. A technology that could simply keep food cold did, in many cases, the same preservation job salt curing had been doing for thousands of years, without the taste, the texture change, or the dependency on a substance a government could tax or ration. Salt didn't disappear from kitchens, obviously, but it stopped being irreplaceable. Once it stopped being irreplaceable, all the old leverage, the roads, the taxes, the wars, the trade empires, stopped making economic sense, which is the part worth sitting with. Salt didn't get less useful. Chemically, it does exactly what it always did. What changed was scarcity, and scarcity, not usefulness, was always the actual source of its price. The same chemical property that once justified a 600-year French tax and helped fund West African empires is now sitting in a plastic shaker that costs less than a cup of coffee, because industrial mining made it abundant and refrigeration made it optional. It's worth pausing on how strange that reversal actually is. For most of human history, the line between salted enough to survive winter and not salted enough was a matter of life and death for entire communities. Now the average person's relationship with salt is almost entirely about taste, arguably even about eating less of it. Doctors more often warning about too much salt in the modern diet than too little. The exact substance that empires fought wars over is now something public health campaigns quietly ask people to use with more restraint. None of this is really a story about a mineral when you look at it directly. It's a story about what happens to value once scarcity disappears. Salt was never valuable because it was rare in some absolute sense. Plenty of it sits in every ocean on Earth. It was valuable because extracting it, moving it, and controlling access to it used to be genuinely difficult. And difficulty, not the substance itself, was always the real commodity being bought and sold. The moment industrial technology made extraction and preservation easy, the difficulty vanished, and the value vanished with it, almost exactly on schedule. So the next time you reach for the salt shaker without a second thought, remember that you're holding the exact same molecule that Roman legions may or may not have literally carried as pay, that camel caravans once hauled across the Sahara and traded for its weight in gold, that the French crown taxed for 600 years, and that Mahatma Gandhi picked up off a beach in 1930 as an act of defiance that helped end an empire. None of that history changed what salt is. It only changed how hard it was to get. And that's really the quiet lesson sitting in your kitchen cabinet. Value was never really about what something does. Sugar, spice, dye, salt, all of it followed the same logic for centuries. Scarce, essential, fought over. Then technology, whether refrigeration, industrial mining, or global shipping, removed the scarcity, and the fighting stopped making sense. The commodity didn't change. The distance between people and the commodity did. We forgot how expensive salt used to be precisely because the problem it used to solve, spoiled food, empty winter stores, no reliable way to preserve a harvest, got solved so completely by other means that most people alive today have never once had to think about it. So the next time you salt your food without a second thought, remember the salt roads, the smuggling laws, the empires funded on trade caravans, and the 24-day walk to a beach that helped end colonial rule. Salt was never ordinary. It only became ordinary once the difficulty of getting it disappeared, and difficulty, it turns out, was the only thing that ever made anything precious in the first place.
Ah, I understand. Follow, and see you next time. For another thing, you'll never look at the same way again.